My friends, who will walk on water with me?
You are looking for a figure who will draw your country towards war.
Yes.
Orange is your man.
I was playing Shylock in The Merchant of Venice at Stratford-on-Avon. I was one of the youngest ever leading men there. I was, about 27, 8, and convinced that, I was going to be the Shakespearean actor. And I got a phone call out of the blue from David Lean. Would it be possible for me to come to London? And if it were possible, could we have a little meeting? And I had a few days off, and I went down, and everybody in the world was to play Lawrence of Arabia except me. And David, he had in those days an Indian wife, Leela, and she traveled around with a guru. The guru had gone to see a little black and white movie called The Day They Robbed the Bank of England, in which I play a young English army officer. And he'd gone to David and said, I've just seen the man who must play Lawrence of Arabia. So David went to see the picture. Having seen the picture, that's when he telephoned me. So we sat together, David and me, in a restaurant, and we talked generally about one thing and another. And he wanted to do a camera test. So there was a mound of sand in the studio. And I sat in front of the pile of sand wearing the frock and the funny hat, and then took it off and then put on an army uniform. And the following morning, David said, look, I want you to play Lawrence of Arabia. And the producer is Sam Spiegel. So I said, David Lean, you're in for a lot of trouble because he doesn't like me. He said, why? I said, well, I pulled a stunt on him about a year ago, and he doesn't like me at all. But David, when he stuck his heels down and was determined, nothing would deter him. So reluctantly, Spiegel agreed. And I said to David, well, I'm prepared to do it with the greatest of pleasure, but I need to read a script, because that's what I do. I make words flesh in the room. I had to read it in the room. And then I met David later on in the afternoon, and he said, what did you think? I said, it is the most beautiful adventure story. And David said, that bad? But he then said, look, who are the young playwrights around? And I said, Robert Bolt. He teaches history, and Robert and I were friendly. The next thing I knew, Robert had taken over and he was doing the last version of the script. I flew out to Jordan, to Amman, and I was introduced to His Majesty, the late King Hussein. And he said, why have you come out so early? I said, well, I've got to learn to ride a camel. I've got to learn how to wear the robes. And in fact, just to get used to the idea of being in the climate, to get acclimatized. Because, when you get into the middle of that bloody desert, I mean, it's a frying pan, and there are days when the heat hurts. And King Hussein said, well, I can introduce you to my desert patrol. And my instructor was Qutayfun Abu Tai, a grandson of Aouda Abu Tai, who was played in the film by Anthony Quinn. So I was taught to ride a camel by Aouda's grandson, which was something. But about a couple of yards of sponge rubber, and I shoved it on my saddle. Within a month, every Bedouin wanted some sponge rubber. So I was requisitioning yards and yards of sponge rubber. So my contribution to Arab civilization is the introduction of sponge rubber for Bedouin to ride on saddles. And I was with these Bedouin for 9 months. They gave me several names, but the first name the Bedouin gave me was Abu Svinj, because it's the nearest they could get to sponge. And finally they called me Fahad, which I was very proud of. It means young lion. And every day was interesting, every day was, and you can imagine working with those actors.
Truly, for some men, nothing is written unless they write it.
He introduced himself as Omar Sharif. I called him Cairo Fred. it was shortened by everybody else to Fred. And we became known to David as the two Freds. Los dos Freds. Remarkable intellect and humour, and he's a graceful and a beautiful man. We just became immediately friendly, and it was like living with a young version of my father, because my father was a professional gambler, and Omar, as you know, is a superb gambler. And we just got on. We still do. We're easy friends. Footprints going over a dune. Well, you can't say to a camel, would you please go over that and do some nice footprints. So Freddie used to do them. He used to put big duster things around his feet and measured exactly a camel's stride. And Freddie would do the camel's footsteps, so he could light the depth of it and the shadows. Wonderful. And in the middle of the desert, there would be David on a deck chair with his cigarette holder, and he's puffing away and thinking. And I would say, vacant or in pensive mood, Dave? Oh, vacant. Or pensive. He'd be thinking of, dreaming. But David led from the front in every single thing we did. The thing that struck me almost immediately when we began filming was his admiration for good acting. He loved it. He was a connoisseur of good acting. He expected the best. And if you gave him the best, you had the best friend in the world. And the moment he began to trust me, we hardly ever spoke other than just to say, where are you going to sit? What are you going to do? And on came the scene where he's given the white robes by his Bedouin friends. David came up to me in the morning and he said, Pete, there's a hole. I said, there's a hole? He said, yes, there's a hole. I said, where? He said, there's a hole in the script between putting the robes on and meeting Aouda Abu Tai. Tell me, Pete, what do you think a young man would do when he wore white robes for the first time in his life? These extraordinary, beautiful silk things. He said, will you think about it? I said, in what respect? He said, well, I want a bit of mine, as it were. What would the young man do if he thought he was alone in the middle of the desert? So I was deeply honoured that he trusted me. And David, a young man, T.E. Lawrence, he was a young man in 1916, 1917. His father died, his favourite brother was killed in France. He was emotionally wrecked. I mean, he adored his father and he adored his brother. The effect it had on him was intense. And here he was, with no brief at all from the British government, liaising with kings, wearing Arab clothes.
To give us Damascus.
It's what I came for.
But T.E. Lawrence was killed just after writing and publishing Seven Pillars of Wisdom. I read Seven Pillars of Wisdom as a duty when I began to do the film, but 15 years back I read it again. And it is literature of the highest order. Angus Wilson, in a column the other day, just said that when he reads Seven Pillars, he calls it the Lawrence music. I mean, that man was writing beautiful, beautiful English. He would have been England's Herman Melville. He would have written a Moby Dick. He would. So we lost not just one of the most eccentric generals and Arab leaders, but a writer of true distinction. But not now. But the first thing he'd said to me on the first day of shooting was, off we go, Pete, on a great adventure. And that stayed with me every time I was feeling a bit down or whatever, as one does, even without having to be in a film in a desert. I would think of that we were in a great adventure. And it was. And he just said, well, Pete, we've done the adventure. We've finished our adventure. And I was very moved, actually. But I could see David was lost. He'd been his life for years. But I was so delighted to get out of the desert that I got hold of the Jeep. I drove the bloody thing back to this little hotel we were in, the Ouarzazate. I got my passport and as much money as I had, and a shirt and a pair of trousers and a jet, and I drove across the Atlas Mountains to Marrakesh, where I filled up with petrol. Then I drove myself in this Jeep with my foot down on the pedal to Casablanca, because I knew Omar, who'd finished the day before, was in a nightclub called the Abattoir. We used to call it the Abattoir. And I wanted to get there before it closed. And, and I did. David Lean was completely open about his methods. Have a look through here, Pete. And I would look through the lens, and I'd get the picture. When he was editing, and he did it on the old sewing machine days with his gloves and his scissors, he would ring me up from time to time to show me things he was doing. He said, I want to show you love cutting, he said to me once, love cutting. He said, well, as you step from the armoured car down to the ground, you're a little bit clumsy. He said, I don't want it, I want to be complete. Well, there was a great bond between David and me, and I was with him when he was dying. I sat with him and I took my young son to meet him. We just sat, we held hands. Talked of first loves. Yes, great filmmaker and an astonishing man. There are times when I'm just completely absorbed in the picture and I see it for what it is. Other times, people ask me if I'm fed up. No. It was one of the most beautiful experiences of my entire life. I love the history of the place. I could do that. I knew my Bible history, the Crusader history. But I'm never fed up. I'm never fed up. I was fortunate and I felt chosen.